we rely solely on primary sources and academic literature.
The Secret Code of America, Translatio Imperii, the American Enigma. Is America truly a unique experiment in human history, or is it the final act of a drama that began millennia ago amidst the ashes of a burning city? Why does every time a president speaks of a city upon a hill, he unknowingly evokes the ghost of a Trojan refugee? Are we truly masters of our own destiny, or are we merely performing a script written in ancient Rome? If you want to understand why America feels exceptional and whether this destiny is a blessing or an imperial curse, you must look beyond the flag. You must decode the code of Translatio Imperii. The answer is not in a history book, but in a mythopoetic process that has transferred the sacredness of power across the ocean. Translatio Imperii, from Rome to the United States. Philological, historical, and mythopoetic analysis of the Aeneas complex in American exceptionalism. The global discourse on imperial continuity. The phenomenon of Translatio Imperii should not be understood merely as a chronological succession of political dominions, but rather as a mythopoetic process of transferring the sacredness of power. The West has built its collective identity on an obsession with legitimation. No new power arises without declaring itself the heir of a previous glory. In this sense, the passing of the torch from Rome to the United States represents the apex of a historical arc that sees civilization constantly moving westward, following the course of the sun. The global discourse presented here is structured on three fundamental pillars. 1. The archetype of the refugee founder. American identity does not emerge from nothing, but inherits the so-called Aeneas complex. Just as the Virgilian hero flees a dying Troy to found a superior civilization, so too did the Pilgrim Fathers and the founders of the American Republic interpret their flight from Europe not as an exile, but as a providential mission. America becomes the new Rome because it accepts the weight of history, Father Anchises, while projecting itself towards a future of expansion, Sun Aeneas. 2. The synthesis of classical destiny and Christian providence. It is necessary to understand how Roman fatum, the ineluctable destiny written by the gods, was absorbed and transformed into Puritan providence. This fusion created a unique ideology of exceptionalism in the world, where the nation does not act out of simple geopolitical calculation, but because it is invested with a divine and historical mandate. 3. The dialectic of mission and hubris. The myth of the city upon a hill carries an unresolved tension. While on one hand it inspires the construction of a universal democracy, on the other it justifies imperial hubris. The parallelism with Rome is total. Peace, Pax Romana, Pax Americana, is often the result of a conquest that myth must ennoble to make it acceptable to the collective consciousness. This overview serves as a compass for the following analysis, allowing us to understand how every single source cited, from the Virgilian poem to Berkovich's analyses, is not an isolated fragment, but a piece of a millennial narrative on the persistence of the imperial idea. The dynamics of Translatio Imperii. Translatio Imperii represents one of the most persistent historiographical and political concepts in Western culture. It postulates the linear and providential transfer of imperial power and civilization from one nation to another, following a symbolic movement from east to west. This dynamic is not a simple succession of geopolitical powers, but a passing of the torch of a sacred and ordering mission. In the context of the transition from Rome to the United States, this theory finds its maximum expression in the parallelism between the founding of Rome, as narrated by Virgil, and the construction of national identity understood as a new Rome, destined to guide humanity. But where does this genetic code of power originate? We must return to a man who carries the weight of the past on his shoulders as he walks towards the unknown. The primary text reveals the first act of this drama, where flight becomes foundation. Publius Virgil Maro, Aeneid, 2919 BC. The archetype of the refugee founder. Virgil's work constitutes the fundamental mythopoetic core of the entire Western civilization and, by extension, of American identity. The poem narrates Aeneas's flight from a burning Troy not as an act of cowardice or passive exile, but as the fulfillment of an inexorable fatum, destiny. Aeneas embodies pietas, a virtue that transcends simple religious devotion to embrace a total duty towards the gods, his homeland, and his family. The so-called Aeneas complex manifests itself in the iconic act of flight. Aeneas carries his elderly father Anchises on his shoulders, who holds the penates, the sacred symbols of the lost homeland, and leads his young son Ascanius, Illus, by the hand. This image encapsulates the essence of Translatio. Anchises, the past, represents the weight of history, tradition, and legitimacy that must be preserved. Aeneas does not abandon his roots in the flames, but physically transfers them to a new land. Ipse subibo humeris, ne me labor iste gravabit. Aeneid 2:708. Ascanius, the future, represents the promise of a new lineage and an empire without end, imperium sine fine. He is the seed of the new Rome that will germinate in the West. Aeneas's mission is therefore the founding of a new Troy that surpasses the original, prefiguring the movement of civilization towards the sunset, Hesperia. In Book 6, Anchises' prophecy establishes Rome's role as the ordering force of the world, regere imperio populos. The violence necessary for founding and conquest is not seen as a crime, but as a ritual sacrifice necessary to establish a superior and providential order. This archetype of the refugee invested with a divine mission would become the conscious or unconscious model for the Pilgrim Fathers and for the entire rhetoric of American exceptionalism. From sword to Bible. Centuries later, that same flight repeats itself, no longer amidst the flames of Troy, but on the icy waves of the Atlantic. How can a Puritan sermon rekindle the fire of Aeneas? Listen as John Winthrop transforms the Puritan fleet into a new Trojan fleet, where the Bible takes the place of the sword. John Winthrop, A Model of Christian Charity, 1630. Written aboard the ship Arbella during the crossing to Massachusetts, this sermon radically transforms the colonial mission from a simple commercial enterprise to a truly sacred and providential undertaking. Winthrop solemnly declares that the new community will be like a city upon a hill, for we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. An image taken from the Gospel of Matthew 5:14, but refounded in a political eschatological sense. Although the language is deeply biblical, the logical structure meticulously echoes the dynamic of Translatio. The abandonment of the corrupt world. Just as Aeneas flees the flames of Troy, The Puritans abandoned Europe and England, perceived as spiritually dying and corrupt lands, to preserve the sacred fire of true faith. The Divine Covenant. Winthrop introduces the idea of a formal covenant with God. The prosperity of the colony will not depend on chance or simple labor, but on faithfulness to this mandate. If the colony fails, it will be a dishonor to God Himself. If it succeeds, it will be a tangible proof of its election. Exceptionalism as responsibility. Being observed by the whole world, the eyes of all people are upon us, transforms the settlement into a universal model. Here the translatio is fulfilled. Moral and civil order no longer resides in the Old World, but has been transferred to the promised American land. This vision introduces for the first time the idea of an exceptional mission, where America is not just one nation among others, but the place where human and divine history converge to establish a new, superior moral order. The Sun Westward. The religious mission soon becomes a philosophical and poetic prophecy. What is the secret of constant civilization's westward movement? Why does power seem to follow the sun's course? George Berkeley captures this unstoppable momentum in a single immortal verse, decoding the destiny of empire. George Berkeley, Verses on the Prospect of Planting Arts and Learning in America, 1726. In this fundamental poetic composition, the bishop and philosopher George Berkeley formalizes and consecrates the concept of westward movement with the famous line, "Westward the course of empire takes its way." Berkeley does not limit himself to a geographical observation, but outlines a true teleology of history based on translatio. The translation of knowledge. Berkeley prophesies that the muses, arts, and sciences, after flourishing in Greece and Rome and declining in a now weary and corrupt Europe, will find their ultimate and definitive expression in America. The New World is not just a land of opportunity, but the final refuge of human wisdom. America as historical fulfillment. America is defined as the final act in the drama of human civilization. Time's noblest offspring is the last. In this view, history is not infinite, but has a qualitative culmination. America is the culmination of a process begun millennia before, the noblest child, because it inherits and purifies all the glory of the past. The solar vector. The westward movement is presented as a natural and providential order. Just as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, so too must the torch of civilization complete its cycle towards the American continent, where the sunset of the Old World becomes the dawn of a new moral and intellectual empire. This prophecy transforms American exceptionalism into a philosophical necessity. America is the place where Translatio Imperii stops, having reached its geographical limit and its spiritual apex. The New Republic, Roman heritage, and American constitutional innovation. The question of how political ideals and philosophical visions could be translated into legal and institutional principles was central to the founding fathers of the United States. In particular, the declaration of a modern nation as the legitimate heir to the Roman Republic without replicating its fatal errors required deep reflection and an innovative constitutional architecture. The answer to this challenge was masterfully articulated by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay in the Federalist Papers, 1787 to 1788, published under the pseudonym Publius. The choice of the pseudonym Publius was not accidental. It evoked the authority and virtue of Publius Valerius Publicola, one of the founders of the Roman Republic, whose cognomen meant friend of the people. This designation served to legitimize the constitutional proposal, presenting it not as a tyrannical imposition, but as an act of republican foundation aimed at the common good. It was a clear response to the anti-federalists, who often used pseudonyms like Cato or Brutus to invoke Roman figures hostile to centralized power, suggesting a parallel between the federal proposal and tyranny. The core of the Federalists' innovation lay in their ability to critically analyze the failures of ancient republics and propose structural solutions. Hamilton, in Federalist No. 9, lamented that the history of the petty republics of Greece and Italy was a spectacle of horror and disgust to the friends of liberty and of republican government. He argued that the science of politics has received great improvement thanks to modern discoveries like the regular distribution of power into distinct departments, the introduction of legislative balances and checks, the institution of courts composed of judges holding their offices during good behavior, the representation of the people in the legislature by deputies of their own election. These elements, according to Hamilton, are entirely new discoveries or have made their principal progress towards perfection in modern times, offering the means to preserve the excellencies of republican government and lessen or avoid their imperfections.
Madison, in Federalist No. 10, addressed the problem of factions, which he defined as a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority, united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. He observed that pure democracies had been spectacles of turbulence and contention, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been inviolate in their deaths. The solution proposed by Madison was the extended republic, which differed from pure democracy in two fundamental aspects. First, the delegation of the government to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Secondly, the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of country over which the latter may be extended. This extension of the political sphere would make it less likely for a single faction to dominate, diluting interests and passions and promoting greater stability. Madison concluded that in the extent and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we behold a republican remedy for the diseases most incident to republican government. In summary, the American Translatio Republicae was not a mere imitation, but a purification and evolution of the Roman model. The Founding Fathers, through the Federalist Papers, not only declared themselves heirs to Roman republican virtue, but reinterpreted and strengthened it with constitutional innovations that aimed to overcome the inherent weaknesses of ancient republics. America thus positioned itself as a unique political experiment capable of adapting republican principles to a vast continent and a complex society, ensuring stability and liberty through a balanced and representative governmental architecture.
The critic's eye. Before moving on to modern analysis, we must pause. Who were these men really? What terms like pietas mean? The critical apparatus provides us with the key. Primary text, critical apparatus. Publius Virgil Moro, 70 to 19 BC, Mantuan poet, author of the Aeneid. John Winthrop, 1858 to 1649, Puritan leader, architect of the city upon a hill ideology. George Berkeley, 1685 to 1753, Anglo-Irish philosopher, advocate of cultural transplantation in the New World. Translatio Imperium, transfer of imperial power according to a providential design. Pietas, sense of duty and responsibility towards the divine and the community.
Decoding the Myth. Now, let's enter the scholar's laboratory. Is it possible that time is not a straight line, but a circle that keeps returning? Aeneid draws us into a concept that challenges our perception of history. Mircea Eliade, The Myth of the Eternal Return, 1949. Eliade analyzes how societies seek to annul historical time through the repetition of archetypal gestures. The founding of a nation is the reiteration of the cosmogonic myth. America, by reproposing the Roman model, seeks to place itself in a sacred time, justifying its existence as a return to primordial order against the chaos of the old world. The Realized Utopia. If time is a return, then progress is a divine mission. But what happens when religion becomes politics? Ernest Tuvson reveals the millenarian root of exceptionalism. Ernest Tuvson, Millennium and Utopia, 1949. Tuvson explores how the idea of progress is linked to millenarian theology. The American mission is eschatological. The United States is the divine instrument to establish the millennium of peace. Translatio Imperii becomes a progression towards final perfection, making American exceptionalism a form of realized utopia. Structured thought. But myth is not just hope, it is also social structure. How does a narrative mediate between democracy and empire? Jean-Pierre Vernant shows us myth as a rigorous form of thought. Jean-Pierre Vernant, Mythes et Pensées chez les Grecs, 1965. Vernant analyzes myth as a structured form of thought. The figure of Aeneas, who carries the past into the future, represents the tension between tradition and innovation. Myth serves to mediate the tension between democratic ideals and the reality of imperial expansion and confrontation with alterity. The Jeremiad. And what if criticism itself were part of the myth? What if lamenting one's sins only served to reinforce the sacred mission? Sack van Berkowitz introduces a concept that overturns our view of American descent. Sack van Berkowitz, The American Jeremiad, 1978. Berkowitz introduces the American Jeremiad, a rhetoric that laments moral failure to reassert the sacred mission. Myth is not static, but a dynamic process of self-correction that prevents the nation from deviating from its manifest destiny. The Act of Substitution. Finally, we arrive at the most uncomfortable question. Does Aeneas truly integrate or simply substitute? Maurizio Bettini confronts us with the shadow of imperial hubris. Maurizio Bettini, The Myth of Aeneas, Contemporary. Bettini analyzes myth through the lens of anthropology, focusing on identity. He notes that while Aeneas integrates diverse elements, in the American context, translatio often becomes an act of substitution and cancellation of the preceding, highlighting imperial hubris. Synthesis of archetypes. We have reached the end, but is it truly the end, or just another beginning of a cycle we cannot break? Here is the persistence of archetypes. Conclusion: the persistence of archetypes and the mythopoiesis of power. The reflection on the American founding reveals how the myth of Translatio Imperii and the so-called Aeneas complex are not mere historical residues, but active forces that continue to shape the identity and external projection of modern superpowers. Translatio, understood as the linear transfer of civilization and power from east to west, finds its final and most complete destination in the United States, transforming geopolitical necessity into a providential mandate. The Aeneas complex perfectly describes the psychology of founding. Like the Virgilian hero who flees the flames of Troy, carrying his elderly father Anchises and the Penates on his shoulders, the colonists and founding fathers sought to preserve the sacred past of classical and European civilization, purifying it, however, from its corruptions. This tension between fleeing the past and selectively preserving it creates an intrinsically dual national identity. America is both a new Rome and its definitive overcoming. In this context, the image of the city upon a hill, originally evoked by John Winthrop in 1630, ceases to be a simple Puritan admonition to become the core of the exceptionalist narrative. The tension between the ideal aspiration to be a moral beacon for humanity and the pragmatic reality of geopolitical power remains the immobile engine of American foreign policy. The analysis of fundamental archetypes reveals a deep continuity between historical roots and their contemporary reelaboration, structuring itself into three main directions.
Firstly, the Translatio Imperii, originally understood as the transfer of imperial power from Rome to the West, has evolved into a powerful justification for global hegemony, being presented as an inevitable and necessary historical destiny. Secondly, the Aeneas complex, which evokes the heroic act of founding a new civilization on the ashes of a preceding one, feeds the narrative of America as a place of refuge and regeneration for the entire West, preserving its essence while innovating its form. Finally, the archetype of the city upon a hill, which has its roots in a moral and pedagogical mission directed at the entire world, today serves as a pillar for legitimizing interventionism and the concept of national exceptionalism, transforming the ethical example into a global political guide. The analysis of these classical archetypes reveals that the construction of American identity is not only a political fact, but a large-scale mythopoetic operation, which even today determines how the United States perceives itself and its role in the world.
This content pleased you. I invite you to like it. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next videos. Your support truly encourages me to keep creating content like this.